I want to bring in Nisreen Abdelmajid really quickly. She's a technical producer at AMI Audio and the producer of Audiobook Review. Nisreen, what do we have to look forward to this AMI Audiobook Review segment that we're going to start in just a couple of minutes?
Greg David joins us, and Greg David is our communications specialist at AMI, who is also an avid audiobook listener. He joins us for one of our favorite segments on the show, a rapid fire review featuring Canadian history books. I think in this segment we will be exposing Greg David as a huge geek. The only history books that I've ever read was in school, to be honest. Jacob, I've never heard you talk about history books, so I want you to be honest with us. How often do you pick up a history book?
Okay, I've picked up a couple history books, but I didn't do it because they were history books. I did it because they were advertised as nonfiction, and then I only realized afterwards, I guess this was like a traditional history book. And I only did it because it was like specific topics that interested me. It wasn't like an academic thing. But history books get a bad rap. They can be really fascinating, especially if you already have a standing interest in that topic. Niz, I want to thank you so much for planning this one out. I'm really excited for it.
For sure. Looking forward to it.
That was Nisreen Abdelmajid. She's a technical producer at AMI Audio and the producer of AMI Audiobook Review. She was joining us from Mississauga. All right, here we go for AMI Audiobook Review. What is history? An echo of the past in the future, a reflex from the future on the past. You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Shymanski. That was a quote from French author Victor Hugo, best known for writing Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. In just a few words, he beautifully describes the reciprocal nature of the relationship between the past and the future, and how the past continues to shape our future today, and how the way we reflect on the past continuously evolves. It makes a strong case for the importance of studying history. We're talking history books today with Greg David, more specifically Canadian history books. How's it going, Greg?
Thanks so much for having me on, and I love the fact that you picked them up because they were nonfiction, and maybe that's kind of the way of getting around this. Is I think when you say history book, and maybe that's that was a mistake that I made in my pitch, was that makes it sound like it's a stodgy textbook, and that isn't the case with the books that we're going to talk about today. They're not; these aren't textbooks that you maybe got in your Canadian history class and were forced to read in high school. These are books that I've read that are nonfiction, but they're about Canadian history.
The funny thing is, if you're picking up a non-fiction book and it ends up being history, you could actually qualify it as fiction, because sometimes history is very iffy when it comes to the facts. You need to make sure you're picking up the right books, especially old history books, because they get obsolete fairly quickly. And that's why when there's a new book coming out... Sorry, what was that?
No, go ahead. Finish your thought. I was just going to jump in and agree with you, so finish your thought.
Oh, okay. I'm glad you weren't going to disagree. No, you need to pick out recent books, especially because they're often based on very recent research and new findings continuously evolve the way we reflect on the past, which ties back to the quote I read from Victor Hugo. Now, we planned a rapid fire review segment with you where you brought us 5 books, 5 of your most recent notable reads that all happen to be Canadian history. Before I explain the rules of rapid fire review, clearly you've been on a sort of Canadian history kick. What prompted that?
It's so weird because I wouldn't have thought about it, that way until I was asked to do this and thought, how can I shake things up? Because I could obviously talk all day about Stephen King books, but then I thought, wait a minute, I've read this, there's one book in particular I want to dive a little bit deeper into, and I thought, wait a minute, I think I've read like a handful of Canadian history books. So I love nonfiction anyway, Jacob, and so these, when those book lists come out at the end of the year, I'll identify a bunch bunch and put them on my Amazon wish list that my family has access to. So a lot of these books I've gotten like for Christmas, over the holidays, or for my birthday, or in a couple of cases I've just ordered myself. So I just look at the title of the book. If I'm drawn into that, then I'll look at what the synopsis is, and that's how all these books ended up actually on my radar.
And I don't think you would have shared them with us unless you actually liked them. What is it about history books that keep you coming back?
I'm just fascinated with the history of the world. If you look at my podcast list, there's a bunch of them in addition to AMI Audiobook Review, of course, and all the other great AMI podcasts. There are a bunch about history. There's one that I'm right now called Empire that I'm listening to and learning about the British East India Company. I'm fascinated with British history and the fact that the British were trying to find, among other countries, the way through the Northwest Passage. So that led to, the history of Northern Canada, and then it led to the history of Canada. So I love to learn. I've got a whole bunch of books right now on Russia and Siberia and Mongolia that are still waiting and getting dusty. So I'm just fascinated by just the history of the world and the civilizations that are involved in it. But I really am fascinated with what's happened already in our own backyard in Canada, and I'm starting to delve into the history of Quebec because that's where I'm living now. So I want to learn more about it.
Well, when you're reading history, like, you're tempted to lean towards the topics that historians have a fascination with, ancient Egypt, ancient Rome. But if you're reading history on the area that you're currently living in, you can actually see the repercussions of history and what that's done to where you live at the current time and how it's shaped where you live right now. And history is a story. If you're reading novels all the time, you'll find that in these history books, there are narratives that go through. They just seem to happen a lot faster. It's less about characters and it's more about, there's almost a plot in a weird way. I know you're not supposed to look at it that way, but I can't help but see these historical figures as characters and a story that has a start, a start, a middle, and an end. It's like a novel.
It absolutely is, Jacob. I mean, you bring up a really good point. You're reading a history book, but it's full of characters. There's a setting, there's a time period. There are things that happen within that story. So that's absolutely, but it's about the storytelling, right? There are ways of telling historical stories that are a lot more engaging than other ones.
Okay, let's get into rapid fire review. Okay. Here's how it works to remind everyone. You provided us 5 books, and we're going to go through them one by one, and you have 15 seconds for each book to give us a synopsis/review. I'm going to read the title and then the author. As soon as I finish saying the author's name, you're going to hear a ticking sound. Once you hear that ticking sound, you can start. Once you hear the bell sound, you got to stop. It's a lot harder than it looks, and I think the point here is to condense your thoughts into something very concise, and that it's like less than an elevator pitch. It's an elevator pitch if you're going up one floor. We'll put it that way. And after we go through all 5 titles, you get to pick one of them to further elaborate on. Sound good?
Sounds great. Let's do it.
Okay, here's the first book. The Company by Stephen R. Bown.
Yeah, so we're going to get into this one in a lot more depth, but this is all about the rise and the fall of the Hudson's Bay Empire and how it ties into the history and expansion of Canada.
With time to spare.
All kinds of time. I'll need those in the other ones.
Okay, perfect. Let's move on quickly to the next one. It is rapid fire review after all. Here's the next one. The Inconvenient Indian by Thomas King.
So author Thomas King gives an account of the relationship between First Nations and colonizers in North America from first contact. It's funny and it's real, and it tells about how Indigenous peoples are portrayed in pop culture, and wrestles with his own experiences as a First Nations rights activist.
It's funny. I would not expect that.
Yes, absolutely. It definitely has its funny moments, and I wanted to include that in there.
Okay, here's the next one. The Wake, The Deadly Legacy of a Newfoundland Tsunami by MacIntyre.
Yeah, sorry, spell check changed it. It's Linden MacIntyre. Former journalist, he recalls the November 1929 tsunami that struck Newfoundland's Burin Peninsula, killing 28 and leaving hundreds homeless, and how that has affected the peninsula up until modern day.
Wow, I had no clue even a single tsunami hit the east coast of Canada at all. Jeez,
Yep.
I'm really curious about that one.
Yeah, that's part of the fascination, is that I didn't know that either until I read this book.
Okay, next one. Spadina, A Story of Old Toronto by Seton Thompson.
Yeah, so the author, whose family lineage lived in this house before Confederation, tells the story of Spadina House, who built it originally, how it was expanded over the years, and it's really a story not only about this historical house in Toronto, but two families that helped found the city and run the city of Toronto.
City history. That's a small-scale history. Usually you'll focus on empires or countries. Interesting. Okay. Last one. Etienne Brule, Le Fils de Champlain by Jean-Claude Laroque and Denis Sauve.
First of all, pitch perfect pronunciation. Love it. This is a French book. It's written for young adults, and it's the history of young Etienne Brule, who signed up at the age of 15 to follow Samuel de Champlain in his 1608 expedition to found Quebec. Books in French, so I've been putting my history French, or my grade 13 history to work on this one.
Sounds like a challenging read, especially if it's not your first language. Do you know if there's a translation in English?
There is no translation in English because I looked for it. And so I've been kind of muscling my way through it, using Google Translate a little bit, but also, again, challenging my grade 13 French to help me through.
If you're listening to the podcast version of the show, we're going to make sure to include all of these 5 selections in the podcast description. Okay. Now you can pick one of these 5 titles to rant, rave, or whatever you want, really. You have the stage. Which one do you want to talk about?
Yeah, so I want to talk about The Company, The Rise and Fall of the Hudson's Bay Empire by Stephen R. Bown. And the reason that I want to bring that up, Jacob, kind of goes back to what we were talking about off the top, where history books, quite often when you think about it, they can be really dry. I took history all the way through high school, and there were some textbooks that I just wanted to throw out the window because it was just so boring to read. And I also think that Canada gets a little bit of a short shrift when it comes to history. You obviously think of Louis Riel and the Métis. You think of Upper and Lower Canada, but you think of Canada as being a very young country and not really having a lot of history. But this book really drove home that Canada does have a really interesting history. And I was hooked from the very beginning of starting to read this. The book starts in 1665 in London, England, and the city has been ravaged by plague. And 2 French men wearing buckskin moccasins and animal skins for clothes have just arrived from New France, where, quote unquote, life was harsh and unpredictable, but the air was at least fresh. And they are pitching the fur trading business to King Charles II, because, of course, at the time, fur was a huge thing in England and in Europe, and it showed as a status symbol if you wore fur. And this meeting between these 2 gentlemen and the King of France really launched the new commercial enterprise known as the Hudson's Bay Company, and it really laid the foundation for much of modern-day Canada.
And the Hudson's Bay Company in this book is the same Hudson's Bay Company like today. Like the bay that you see at the mall, that's the same company. They've existed since the 1600s.
Exactly. Yeah. And, geographically speaking, if you just had a lot of hours north of where you're based in Toronto, you hit Hudson's Bay. And that was the area that when the fur traders first settled, it was in the Hudson's Bay. That was the base because they could build forts there. It was easy to get out of the bay and back to England with the furs that were gathered at the time. So, I mean, when you're reading this book, the author vividly captures the harsh wilderness of Canada and facing these British employees who were coming to this country where snow would be several feet deep and sub-zero temperatures, and they had to learn really fast how to survive in that climate. And of course, that meant a connection with the indigenous peoples that had already been there for thousands of years, and there was a real trading that began with them of with the First Nations people, showing people how to survive, and with the British they started to trade some of their metal goods and things like that. So it was the first contact was with the Cree, and so they bartered with goods for the British, and in turn, the British learned about these beaver pelts that were huge in Canada compared to what they had back in Europe, because the beaver at that point in Europe had been basically like gathered and hunted almost to extinction. And so they had these massive beaver pelts that were found in Canada. And that was the whole basis of the trade. The British said, yeah, man, we're all in on this. And the Hudson's Bay Company was founded and started.
You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review. I'm Jacob Shymanski, talking to Greg David about Canadian history books. Greg, I actually read about 50% of this book, and the one thing I really loved about it is how it's going to sound like a complaint, but I really liked it. There were so many tangents to just explain the context of everything. Like, they would casually drop the fact that they would often exchange, like, metal knives in exchange for beaver pelts with the indigenous peoples, and then they would go into the importance of like how the indigenous people like reacted to having these metal knives and how it was incredibly useful to them, and like go into detail about how they use the knives in like very interesting ways, and started like cutting tobacco instead of the very like labor intensive like finger ripping of tobacco that they were doing before, but that it was also a reciprocal relationship, because the indigenous peoples really helped the people who were working for the Hudson's Bay Company up north in the bay by showing them how to make better canoes, learning about the land, what was edible, where the best hunting grounds were. And the Hudson's Bay Company would not have gotten beaver pelts if it wasn't for all of the indigenous hunters that would make their way to these trading posts on the shore of the Hudson's Bay. And another interesting thing about having outposts on the Hudson's Bay, that shore is still incredibly remote to this day. Imagine how isolated it must have felt to be on the shore of the Hudson back in the early 1700s. You mentioned that he's very vivid about his descriptions of like the lifestyle back then. I thought that was one of the most shocking things to me.
Yeah, me too. And you're right. I mean, it's very hard to get up to that area even now. I mean, Churchill, you can fly into it. There is a train that goes up there, but you can't just kind of hop in the car and just kind of head for Hudson's Bay. That isn't the way that it works up there. So it is, like you said, it continues to be very remote. And, I think some of the most vivid in addition to the weather, but they talked about the mosquitoes and the black flies and how, you couldn't even open your mouth because you were so besieged that they would all fly into your mouth, and how it really played on the mental health of the British as well, because they were, under this onslaught of bugs that were on them all the time, and how it really wore them down. And, of course, they're being bitten and there's blood loss and everything. So it really was kind of a miserable existence for them. And I'm glad that you brought up that relationship between the indigenous peoples and the British, because I think that, obviously there are bad things that happen in that relationship. And obviously you think about alcohol and being and land being taken from the indigenous peoples as part of that. But it really was a back and forth. There was intermarriage between the British and the First Nations women there. So there was a lot of quote unquote good that went along with that relationship. But you're right. I mean, there would be no Hudson's Bay without the fact that the First Nations people helped them out so much, and with things that they were already doing. They were already hunting for furs, and like you said, showed the British the best places, and really helped with the navigation of the rivers and the whole system in that area.
And the book does tell the story in chronological order from the start all the way to almost modern day, and it's very fast paced in a way where it won't linger on one person's life. It really is about the company and all the people who interacted with the company. And it's interesting that this is a history book, but it doesn't go out of its way to make its sources clear. I have read some in the past where they very clearly talk about different accounts and contradictory accounts about certain events. But this book doesn't really do that. It seems to really take a stance on what happened. And in a way, it's kind of low on detail, but it does tell you so many kind of surface level things, if that makes sense. It doesn't go into incredible detail in people's lives because we just don't have those details. But when you combine what we do know and from all the accounts that we know from people back then, it ends up being a massive wealth of information. And I think that's when those tangents that I mentioned come along, because in terms of like the structure of the book, it tells the story of the company following certain people, and then when they mention certain details of the company, they'll go on a tangent about, for example, like the supply chain of beaver pelts, how they would come from often the Cree, traded at the outposts, and then go all the way to England and then sent to Russia to be processed there, because that was the only place they could properly process the furs for a long time, and then sent back to England where all the best hat makers are, because what people really wanted was beaver pelt hats. There's also all sorts of interesting tangents, like the hilarious disconnect between the company employees in London and the people who actually worked in the trading outposts, where the outposts, they need things to trade with the indigenous peoples in order to get these pelts. So the people in London would send ships full of supplies to trade with, but then they would send really heavy kettles and swords that are too heavy to put in a canoe, and then they would just stay in a warehouse and waste space. And it was just like unpredictable. They asked for bayonets to put on muskets, but they ended up getting swords, and that created a lot of tension. Another thing I thought was super interesting was how in multiple places it described how the native peoples were very keen in recognizing the sincerity of ceremonies and like gift giving, where occasionally the indigenous peoples would receive a gift, but they would see it as just here's something so that you'll trade with us, and not like a real genuine and sincere like message of goodwill. And it shows the complexity of the indigenous peoples. And on that topic, there is a big cultural difference between the different indigenous peoples, the Blackfoots, the Crees, the Huron, and the Mohawks. They were all seen as very different, and this book makes it really clear.
Yeah. I'm glad that you brought that up, and that difference. And it's something that I really didn't know, even though where I grew up is outside of the Six Nations Reserve. I really didn't learn too much about the differences between the Confederates. So this book really helped with that. And this book really read like a novel to me. Like you said, it was fast-paced, full of characters, a lot of footnotes if you're reading the physical book, which led me not only through the footnotes, but also just reading, where it caused me to put the book down and do a Google search on some of these characters, because there were names being dropped in there that I didn't know, didn't recognize. But yeah, getting back to the ceremony thing, I thought that was really interesting too. The subtleties between the different the different groups of First Nations people, and how the British, started to recognize the importance of some of these ceremonies, and how important it was to trade.
I do want to bring up a couple other history books that I've read that I would recommend. They're kind of similar in style. There's one called 1491 by Charles C. Mann, or 1491 by Charles C. Mann. That's a book about pre-contact, the Americas in pre-contact times, and what we know about what the indigenous peoples lived like before contact. And there's always an image that when the Europeans arrived, that there was this big, grand, green, clean land for like ripe for the taking. But the truth is, the indigenous peoples shaped the land to what they needed it for. And they were very creative with their farming and the way they organized their cities and politics. It was there's just been a lot of archaeological evidence to come out recently that really challenges our views on what we always thought the Americas were before European contact. And it's a really good book to open your perspective on that. There was another one called Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow. That's actually the history book that they based the play, the musical Hamilton, on. It's a bulky one. It's like 45 hours or something. This one's a bit dry, but you can totally see why Lin-Manuel Miranda, the playwright who wrote Hamilton, when he was reading this book, why he would see Alexander Hamilton as such a fascinating character. And finally, this is the one I would recommend the most. A Night to Remember by Walter Lord is a historical account of the sinking of the Titanic. It came out in the 50s, and the author interviewed hundreds of people and survivors from the Titanic, and it's a collection of first-hand accounts in chronological order. And this one, unlike The Company, does cite sources and point out contradictory testimony, which I think is really interesting.
Wow. All three great picks. I actually have 1491 on my bookshelf. I read that one as well. And what fascinated me was the history of the indigenous peoples in South America. Because again, in Canada, you learn about Canada and North America. But for me, 1491, I really loved the telling of what happened with First Contact down in South America.
Greg, I want to thank you so much for bringing all these books to us. I think history is very misunderstood. Not just actual history, but history books as like an entertainment product, because they are written to be readable and not just like Wikipedia articles, you know. But thank you so much. I'm really interested in picking up a couple of the other ones that you mentioned.
Thanks so much for having me, Jacob. It's a pleasure.
Cheers. That was Greg David, communications specialist at AMI. Remember, we post all the AMI audiobook review segments as a podcast. Just look up AMI audiobook review on any podcast platform. And we do the same for the AMI audio digest and feature interviews. Those you can find on the AMI Today podcast feed. Just look up AMI Today. That's it for us today. We'll be back on Monday, same time, for more of what's happening on AMI Audio. You were listening to AMI Today. I was your host, Jacob Shymanski. Have a good one.